Okay, good morning, everyone. At present, there appears to be a consensus that there has been a resurgence of religion marked by the rise of political religions in the 21st century. In fact, religion has always been there and always been important, but scholars failed to give it the same attention accorded it in the study of history and politics that was the norm for all centuries prior to the 20th century. Once the closely intertwined relations between church and state are subjected to the sort of systematic study required, I am confident that the protean nature and paradoxical behaviour about which Dr. Brandon spoke so eloquently will be confirmed, along with the extensive continuities from past to present that still characterise church-state relations. Certainly during the course of the Cold War, churches either side of the East-West divide were both key supporters of and key challengers to their respective governments' Cold War policies. Now, why I think religion needs this sort of systematic study is because as George Orwell tells us, the past is very important in understanding the present. And as we know, politicians and governments like to have their own narrative about the present in order to justify their policies. And religion still remains a key element in legitimising and sanctifying government policies and individual secular leaders. So this systematic study is important and it is required. And to show you to the extent to which it's been neglected, we just need to refer to the history of the Cold War. Now, this isn't just simply self-promotion. The Cold War has to be one of the most studied periods in 20th century history. Mainly dominated by the Americans in the first part of the Cold War. Latterly, other Europeans came in, and then we see culture coming in the 90s. But even in the 90s, when the study was very firmly focused on culture, there was still very little attention paid to religion. So this book here, Religion in the Cold War, which derived from a conference held in 2000, obviously about religion in the Cold War, was the first scholarly study of which I am aware to give some sort of systematic appreciation of the role that religion played. And the sole intention of this book was to say there was a religious dimension and it mattered and it should be looked at. After that, what we see just a few years later is a great deal of emphasis on the importance of religion, to the extent it was actually suggested that it was a causal factor. Now, very importantly, we all write the past from the prism of the present, and this literature was appearing during, or the research for it was being done during the George W. Bush period. And certainly that does appear to have been an influence because, as we know, there was a model of a churchman who did insist that he took his policies from a higher power. So this also confirmed very much the sort of propaganda presentation of the Cold War when the Cold War was actually an active entity. In other words, that it was a conflict between the godless and the godly, a conflict between good and evil. And that was very much the presentation in the West of that conflict. And it was a very powerful image. And so if you look at George Bush again, a lot of this literature has, as it were, confirmed American exceptionalism, given the impression that Bush was the inheritor of a legacy of America as the God-given nation with the divine right to lead the free world because of its uniqueness, and particularly stressing its religiosity during a century when other nations had been moving and been influenced by secularism. The most recent scholarship to come out addressing the importance of religion in the Cold War, another collected volume edited by Philip E. Muhlenbeck and giving it a global perspective and bringing in other religions as well, Buddhism and Islam and so forth, argues that religion was a factor. It goes back actually to the 2003 volume and says, it really confirms what it was saying, that it was a factor, but argues that it wasn't a factor. It wasn't the factor. And I would like to, that certainly is the line that I would take. And also that the salience of religion rises and falls and is more important at some points in the Cold War than it is at other points. Sorry, you can't read this, but if anybody wants a PowerPoint afterwards, I'm happy to send it to you. This is just me going through what I consider a very important book written by Jonathan Herzog. And in actual fact, the book doesn't have anything particularly new in it. It looks at the McCarthy period. But what it shows very, very distinctly is the way in which, in the immediate post-war period, there was a concerted effort within America, and we're talking about as early as 1946, to bring together Hollywood moguls, press barons, businessmen, politicians, and churchmen, all to, shall we say, encourage a religious revival in America. So this was, as McCarthyism has been shown to be, a top-down effort, not a grassroots religious revival, but a top-down effort, which actually had a great deal of success, and interestingly was very much linked to American nationalism. So it's from this period that we see under God in the 1950s added to the Pledge of Allegiance and on the currency. And the idea of being a good American meant being a good, not Christian, interestingly, being a good person of religion. And the reason that it was religion rather than Christianity is that in this period, the Americans were concerned to use religion to buttress their imperial extension, for want of a better word. And Christianity was far too tainted from the 19th century with colonialism. So you had to present yourself as a nation that had religious ideals rather than simply Christian ideals if you wanted your leadership to be accepted by other faith convictions around the world. So this is important. Now, Herzog concludes that in the course of the 20th century, America moved from being a secular nation, and he brings in the statistics to show that in the 1930s, America was on the same secularist route as was every other nation in the developed world. But by the end of the 20th century, America is a covenant nation. So in essence, what is required in the study of religion and politics and history is that evolution and transition that is made not simply in America, but in the relationship between religion and politics generally from the end of the 19th century to the beginning of the 21st century. And interestingly, at the moment, the most exciting Cold War scholarship is coming out of Eastern Europe. And there they are looking at religion along with the politics, the culture, the economics, the military factors as well. I've spoken earlier about how it wasn't me that actually said the Iron Curtain was a colander. This is younger scholars in Eastern Europe, and their argument, which is the antithesis to a lot of the arguments, particularly the sorts of John Lewis Gaddis presentations about the triumphalism of the West defeating communism and contributing to the demise of the Soviet bloc. What they're arguing there, that the Iron Curtain was a myth, that it was actually a colander, that there was a lot of interaction between East and West, and that without that trade interaction in particular, the Soviet bloc could not have survived and it would have collapsed an awful lot sooner. So watch that space for, East European, I've lost my... All right, so this slide was just to look at, can we have it on the big screen? It's not... I'm sorry, I can't read it from here either. But essentially what I'm wanting to do here is, again, emphasise the importance of the links between religion, politics and history. So whereas in the West the tendency was to see the propaganda image of the Soviet bloc as simply being a nation where religion didn't exist, where it was being systematically destroyed. The reality is that just as the West sought to mobilise their churches, so did Soviet leaders in the Eastern Bloc. Now, what was key, and this doesn't derive from the Cold War, this actually derives from the 19th century. What was key to Western propaganda was the fact that Marxist atheism was, if you will, the Achilles heel of Marxism in a post-war period when people everywhere were looking for a new world order, when capitalism had been discredited by fascism, and socialism seemed to offer a viable alternative. So what you need to consider is that the East-West conflict can be seen as a contention between two models of modernization: the communist model, represented by the Soviet bloc, and the capitalist model, represented obviously by the free world. So in terms of atheism being a weakness, this is where Western propaganda tended to focus their attention in order to discredit not simply communism, but also socialism as well. And of course, with the Third World being a key factor of contention, religion was seen as a means to inoculate the very peoples who would most benefit from socialist ideas implemented in their economies. So what we actually see, and this goes back to the fact that the churches can be both challengers to as well as supporters of the state, is that very often churchmen and certain churches as well challenged capitalist ideas and the general Cold War policies. So what we see in this period is a transition, because the churches don't prove sufficiently reliable partners in this period for capitalist states. So we see an appropriation on the part of secular leaders of religious rhetoric. And if there is, I can't see it. Is this it? Or is it?
No. Sorry, it's beyond my competence.
Oh, well, okay, don't worry. I'll miss this bit up because I know that we're going to be talking later on about other elements of US policies towards religion. But this more or less emphasises the point that I'm trying to make, that what we see is this appropriation on the part of secular leaders of religion to legitimise and sanctify policies which church leaders are reluctant to sanctify. Now, one of the most interesting examples is the peace movement. In the Soviet bloc, the peace movement creates the space in which communist governments can come together with churches legitimately, because peace is a gospel value, if you will. Whereas in the West, where the peace movement is seen as the Soviet-inspired peace movement and hence a subversive movement, it ends up dividing the churches, because remember, one of the key iconic characteristics of the Cold War is the mushroom cloud, nuclear weapons. And in the Soviet bloc, the churches can all come together quite happily to condemn a nuclear war, whereas in the West it actually ends up being a divisive factor. This is the image that we're most used to. If anyone can see it, this is General Tito in Yugoslavia during the post-war trials of Christian clerics in the Soviet bloc. The foreign minister in Yugoslavia, remember by then you'd had the Tito-Stalin split, advised that Archbishop Stepanak be shot. Shoot the Archbishop were his terms. But at this point, religious persecution was being used by the West as a means of indicting the communist regimes. And Tito told the Archbishop of York, who went out to express the concern of Western Christians about religious persecution. And he said, we are not such fools as to kill an archbishop. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that basically the Soviet leadership, including Stalin, were very pragmatic about their approach to religion. They had tried to eradicate it, particularly in the 1930s, and it hadn't worked. So they knew it wasn't going to work. Their problem was they didn't really understand religion. They had one model that religion was a reactionary force that would seek to destroy the revolution. So whatever they did, they didn't do it too well. But what you end up with in the course of the 20th century that does have an impact on the churches, that does need to be studied, was, if you will, forced secularization in the Soviet bloc, which did not work, and encouraged religiosity in the Western bloc, which seems to have worked in America, but not that successfully elsewhere. But the repercussions do need to be studied. So this is basically outlining whether or not the religious persecution that's indicted from the West can be seen as actually political persecution, because the Soviets did believe that the West was out to get them using religion, was very, very wary of the Vatican in particular, thought it was in cahoots with the Western world. And felt that churchmen who spoke against the regime actually were challenging it. Obviously, when we're looking at the Cold War, when we're looking at the role of religion, we are looking at ideology. And there's a lot of emphasis on Marxism, Leninism, but we have to recognize that the West was ideological as well. Both sides were ideological, both sides were pragmatic. And in terms of trying to decide where you put weight, witness testimony is very important. And obviously this is a figure of John Paul II, and the importance of John Paul II is in the popular the popular concept of the Cold War as a battle between good and evil. Ronald Reagan, the born-again president, comes together with John Paul II, the anti-communist Pope, and together they bring down the Soviet bloc. But if you actually look at the words of John Paul II, he actually I wouldn't say regrets the demise of the Soviet bloc. He certainly doesn't. But he regrets, if you will, that the baby was thrown out with the bathwater, and that the good things that Marxism achieved in the Soviet bloc were insufficiently recognised. And just finally, a project with which I'm involved, which is trying to look at the Cold War and bring together scholars of every discipline, theologians, political scientists, historians, sociologists, together with churchmen who are still alive, who lived through and were active in the foreign policy of their governments in a variety of ways, to try to thrash out precisely what happened during the religious Cold War. Thank you.